So now we are going to start the first roundtable. So I'm calling our panelists, Professor François Gemenne, Professor Dulo Nyaoro, Hamed Idris, Mr. Peter Haley, and Mrs. Trufosa Anjishi. So while you are taking a seat at the roundtable, maybe just a few words. So I want to thank all the persons. Actually, since May, since we came here, we have interacted a lot with you all, and it has been really intense. I want to give a special thank to the scientific committee. Dr. Halima Sadou, we are thinking a lot about her because she couldn't make it today. Professor Shem Wandiga, you were very active, also with Professor Robert Mudida from Strathmore University. You are from Nairobi University, and Dr. William Somn as well. I really want to thank again, it has been done to my colleague of ICHA. Actually, ICHA is just like the foundation. What we are research centers created by our own national societies, Red Cross and Red Crescent national societies. And really the aim of bridging our practices as Red Cross and research, this is something that really is happening, and we hope that it will benefit to the whole sector. So after Dakar, Abidjan, Antananarivo, Beirut, and Yaoundé, Nairobi is hosting this 6th edition of this cycle of conference. What is it about? So this cycle has been specially designed to bring together you, decision makers, practitioners, and thinkers of humanitarian action in one single country. The country approach for us is very fundamental. Humanitarian action has very much been thought in terms of crisis. Now, for us, it's really important that we allow to reconcile international humanitarian action and crisis with public policies, national norms, and civil society. So this is our first edition in English, so sometimes you will see it's not so easy to switch for us from one language to another, and also the first in East Africa. The Agence Universitaire de la Francophonie, which is a network of 900 universities, French-speaking universities in the world, and the French Embassy made it possible today to invite our colleagues from the universities in Cameroon, in Switzerland, in Benin, in France, and in Belgium. Actually, I've been very positively surprised that the request came from you. When I talk with many of you, the request was how we can meet the other university and maybe speak to each other much more. We have a strong conviction at the Foundation that bringing back diversity in languages, representation will mix more ideas, more concepts, and more vision of the world and experience. And thus will open the door, we hope, to a much more inclusive and participative solution. And we are very happy that Kenya is very supportive of this approach. This conference is above all a dialogue. A dialogue, unfortunately, that is not happening. Well, not enough. We can see it in the academic conference where NGOs are absent. We notice it in humanitarian fora where universities are not much invited. We also hear it from local NGOs and non-capital universities which has difficulties to access international platforms. And we also notice it in the flow of humanitarian international funding and NGOs investment, where actually a negligible part of it is dedicated to research and development. And as Dr. Abbas said, this is not a surprise. The humanitarian sector is not free of using its own funding, so it is a whole system that we need to question, and we need to have things move. There is a great chance, actually, that if researchers and NGOs and practitioners would have worked much more hand in hand since 50 years, that we may have gone quicker with more sustainable solutions. Why is it so urgent now, this conference, to speak about the humanitarian transition? It's because we are in this very specific period of humanitarian transition. So maybe a word of explanation about the title of this conference. The humanitarian sector has always evolved and has always known transformation. But Actually, since its inception at the end of the 19th century with modern humanitarianism and the foundation of the Red Cross, we were mainly with the same system in terms of factors, norms, and principles. But since 20 years, the system is experiencing little change or huge changing, and we may witness a change of paradigm. What is this new paradigm about? Is it one new paradigm? Is this fragmented new ecosystems? In which way does it improve the condition of the affected communities? And in which measure does it impact us all, humanitarian organizations? The 6th roundtable that we'll have today and tomorrow has been programmed to focus on the specificities of humanitarian action in Kenya. They apprehend the role of the different actors and the different layers of intervention, how they articulate one to another, the inequalities and limits that do not allow an optimized response, and also the opportunities and positive change that are opening new dynamics. We hope that the dialogue in each of the roundtable will give us idea of recommendation and really shape concrete ideas for a better action. And last, why we speak about ethics in the title as well. We are in a very quick moving environment. The law is not ready to frame action and behaviors, and the humanitarian principles and good intentions are sometimes not enough to prevent us from doing harm non-intentionally. So how ethics can help? Our second day we strongly focus on or strongly relate on the 4 ethics principles of autonomy, beneficence, non-maleficence, and justice to help us to ask ourselves the right question and maybe to help us to make decisions in this very moving environment. So now let's start. We start the first roundtable on contextualizing humanitarian action in Kenya and how to address the national needs in this regional humanitarian perspective. I will now move. Oh no, I stay here. I will come at the table after. I will moderate. I have the great pleasure to moderate this roundtable with Professor François Gemenne, who just arrived from Paris a couple of minutes ago. So François, you are a specialist of environmental geopolitics in political science. We were speaking about climate change. The different disciplines are also integrating climate change in their analysis, including natural disasters, policies of adaptation to climate change, and you have conducted multiple field studies in New Orleans, Tuvalu, China, Kyrgyzstan, Mauritius, and Japan. And you're an associate professor and lecturer in different French-speaking universities, such as Liège, University of Versailles, Sciences Po, Paris, and Grenoble, and the Free University of Belgium. François, la parole est à vous.
Thank you very much. Would you like me to speak from here, or would you like me to go to the lectern?
Oh, we can ask you that.
Oh, no, good.
Oh, you feel comfortable.
Well, good morning to all of you, and thanks a lot for having me today at this conference. I want to thank in particular the Foundation of the French Red Cross for having me and for taking the initiative indeed of bringing together different stakeholders, humanitarians, policymakers, but also researchers. And indeed, as you were saying moments ago, I think that it is absolutely crucial that we initiate a stronger collaboration and cooperation between researchers, humanitarians, and policymakers. And I'll speak from a kind of researcher point of view. As you said, I work on many of the issues that policymakers and humanitarians have to deal with on a daily basis. I work on the human impacts of climate change, I work on natural disasters, but also on conflicts and security issues induced by environmental disruption, as well as public health impacts. These are all fields and topics that are of great concern for policymakers and humanitarians in the region. And I feel there is much we could do together to improve not just policymaking or humanitarian action, but there is also a lot that humanitarians and policymakers can do to improve research. And even though we conduct a lot of field work, and I say we because I'm now too old to spend 3 or 4 months on the field, that was in my younger years, but my PhD students and my postdocs still spend a lot of time on the field, and I can see how much they benefit from contacts with policymakers and humanitarians, because it also gives a kind of fresh perspective on research. And I think that typically, and certainly in a French context, policymaking and research were sometimes too much clustered. And there was this idea that research should not be influenced by policymaking, that researchers should ask the questions, not policymakers. I think that to a certain extent we need to revisit that. And although the independence of research is still of primary importance, I think that we need to realize that one of the key purposes of research, when you do research on topics that are so important for the region, is also to try and see how research can serve the interest of the people in the region, in Kenya, and around, and how research can help policymakers and humanitarians design and implement better policies. Obviously, the human impacts of climate change are already a major issue for the region, be it in terms of land disputes, migration and displacement, possible health impacts. All of this resonate with our work. I very much welcome the fact that these workshops takes place in the Horn of Africa. Coming from a French-speaking research perspective, there is often a tendency for French researchers to lean towards Western Francophone Africa. This has created, I believe, a very harmful bias in research, where most of the research in the Francophone world on sub-Saharan Africa actually means on Western Africa. I believe the Horn of Africa has been neglected by Francophone research, and I think that in a way there is a lot we need to do, we researchers, to catch up on this. And this is the reason why I think that these 2 days of exchange, of networking between us, will be of great value for me and for all researchers in the room. I just want to provide one example of the kind of things that we've done in the past in West Africa. Last year, with the University of Ouagadougou, we organized a major regional conference in Burkina Faso on environmental change and migration and how these 2 topics related to each other. And we were extremely surprised that there were lots of excellent expertise in the region, and that we brought in a lot of researchers from France, Belgium, and Switzerland working on these issues, and we made them work with researchers from the region. And this conference actually provided the basis for the formation of a regional network of research and expertise on these topics. I very much that possibly this is something that we could also envision in the Horn of Africa, because the issues to some extent are very similar. I did work in the past with government representatives, with IGAD, the Regional Organization for Development, and I could feel that there were many, many avenues where we could work together. And we researchers based in Europe need to acknowledge that we do not recognize enough the local expertise on these issues in the countries that we study. Typically, researchers and colleagues from African universities do not have access to international publications, do not have access to international conferences, do not have access to international networks. I think we need to work together to make sure that their work is fully integrated in global networks of research. On issues like this, we cannot let a divide to be created between research that would be conducted by European researchers on the Horn of Africa or on West Africa, and neglect the local research, which is really important and really extremely diversified. And I think that it is up to us and up to meetings like this one to create the bridges that would really allow the local expertise and the regional expertise to be not only fully recognized, but also fully integrated in the research results in international networks, so that it can have an impact on policy making, and so that it can have an impact beyond the region, and also teach a few lessons to other places in the world that are confronted with similar challenges. So I want to thank you very much. I very much look forward to these 2 days of exchanges and networking between us. And we'll start with the first roundtable, setting the stage of humanitarian action in Kenya. Thank you very much.
Many thanks. So we are going to start with an historical perspective on humanitarian action and civil society in Kenya. For that, I've got Professor Dulo Nyaoro. You're coming all the way from Moi University, and you're political scientist and anthropologist as well. You've studied in different countries, like in South Africa, and your focus of research in 15 years is migration and displacements in East and South Africa. Professor.
Sorry, thank you. I work in Moi University as a lecturer, but I do research on migration and displacement. I was given just 10 minutes to make this presentation, which of course is very short, as you see, because it's supposed to be a historical perspective. I want to assure Dr. Goulet that professors in the university no longer have the luxury, to stroke their beards, because technology has put a big challenge, because students have more information than you can digest. But not only that, we are working very closely now with the government bodies, the civil society, and other researchers to question some of the things that are happening. Do I move it? This. All right. So I've just given a few things that I wanted to say. I will probably not cover everything, but I will just give you an indication of the humanitarian problems or humanitarian needs that we have because of our geographical context, our population, our governance and capacity from a historical perspective, disasters and preparedness, and then the role of humanitarian actors, and challenges and possible remedies. That is Kenya. Beautiful. Can you all see it? Well, it's a bit hazy. Maybe my eyes are bad. But what you want to get from there is the red parts all the way to the yellow parts are arid and semi-arid. That is, the country is basically about 83% of the country is arid and semi-arid, with very minimal rainfall. And most of it sparsely populated. So those are the climatic conditions. 83% is classified as arid and semi-arid. And this, what this means is vulnerable to climate and environmental change. This is our biggest threat as a country, really, is climate and environmental change. We are exposed to, water scarcity, more frequent and more extreme droughts and related losses of soil fertility are the most important consequences of what we have in the country. We can see indications are that the minimum temperature, actually this is evidence of climate change. Temperatures have risen, 1 to 2% in the last 50 years. And this contributes to slow onset degradation and desertification of natural environment. We've seen that. Now, in that environment, we have a population of about 45.8 million. It is estimated that maybe by next year we will be 52 million. We are very prolific. If the fertility rate remains at 2.9%. But the most interesting thing is that the 70% of the population is below the age of 20. I was shocked when I reread this. I didn't want to believe it. But this is what our national statistics actually say. You can't believe. So me and a few of us here are odd ones out. If you walk on the streets, you look like a dinosaur. Now, 31% of the population live in urban areas, and 69% live in rural areas. Now, this 69% that live in rural area, almost half of it actually rely on that 83% that we saw. Our economy, again, the figures are given there. But what we want to pick out is that that the nice figures of talking about 99 billion and per capita and the rest doesn't mention down here that 95% of Kenyans' agriculture, which is rain-fed. Again, that tells you what it means, what climate means for us. And that 60% of livestock that is produced in Kenya is actually produced in the arid and semi-arid areas, where the 90% of the population that live there actually rely totally, completely on these livestock. And it employs 10 million people. This is normally not captured in our statistics. And I know IGAD, for example, has raised a red flag that our Kenya National Bureau of Statistics doesn't give an accurate figure on this. And this is partly why probably we don't get it right when it comes to intervention in the arid and semi-arid areas. So data does matter. This is a little, I don't know if you guys can see it. In recent history, I think almost 30 years, we can see what has happened. And actually there are just two causes of disasters in Kenya, and that is drought and floods. And of course, there was one time there was an epidemic that affected 6.5 million people. But you can see the number of people that are affected. And then I've made some remarks at the end. Sometimes these things happen when there's a lot of political instability, or they get compounded, meaning that government's ability to intervene is quite compromised. And this is particularly if we go back to recent history, you can see in 2008, there was drought. And those of us who know, 2008 was when the effect of post-election violence was being felt. So this was really compounded. The 2011, this was compounded by the return of refugees, Somali refugees who had gone back. When things went so bad, they actually came back to Kenya. This is the first time that, if we remember well, I think this was done under Kenya Red Cross, Kenya for Kenya, when there was internally mobilized resources from Kenyans to help other Kenyans, if you remember. So this is, those are how the figures look like. Sorry. Something missing? Sorry, I think something is missing out there. But anyway, what I wanted to, what I would add from there, from the figures that you have seen, is that besides those natural disasters, we do also have human-made disasters, which are, as we have seen, the population is increasing very fast, and the population is, in 1999, only 19% of Kenyans were living in urban areas. In 2009, this was 29%. Our urban centers are not prepared to, to host that kind of population. So what do we have? We have informal centers, informal settlements, almost in all our urban areas, which are, hotspots for disasters. We do know that. Now, when we are talking about preparedness, the Kenya government has put in place several organizations, several institutions, several policy. I know there's drought monitoring. I know there's forestry, there's water authority that manages floods. There are several. But one thing that, that came out of those organizations that we see is that they lack coordination. They lack one central office that can champion, disaster preparedness. And this is why you can see, for example, when a disaster strikes, as late as 2011, you can see we have a disaster that actually still affects millions of people. Yet we have so many organizations, government bodies that are supposed to take care of those disasters. Now, the other thing that we want to know about preparedness is that there have been humanitarian organizations in Kenya for a long time, but they have gone about three phases that I would talk about. There's there were organizations that were there before 1990, which really served to a limited extent. Then after 1990, after the end of the Cold War, something happened. And Kenya was out of the good books with many bilateral donors. And it reached a time when many of our partners were not channeling money through the Kenya government. They were actually channeling money through donors and, through humanitarian actors. And this reached a stage that the previous government, or the government of the day at that time, President Moi didn't like it. And those of us who are older may remember NORAD. The best example was NORAD, the Norwegian Development Agency. And to show that the government was unhappy, NORAD was doing a lot of work in northwestern Kenya, in the Rift Valley region. And one day, the Kenya government decided that they were no longer wanted, and they left. I remember some of my colleagues in the university at that time were being sponsored by NORAD to do their PhD. Some of them were in Europe, some of them were in America. So you can imagine, word reaches you when you are supposed to pay tuition, that money is no longer coming. And that is just an example of that second phase. But then what followed is that during the big influx of refugees, our government was so constrained that they said, we are unable to deliver the services to refugees. So UNHCR, please come in. So the Kenya government created a big humanitarian space, if I would call it that, a big humanitarian space. And since then, we have seen so many humanitarian organizations in this country. But not only that, we do know that our neighbors have had many problems, and many of the humanitarian actors actually operate from Nairobi to Somalia, Southern Sudan, and many other areas. Now, to finish, I will just point out some of the challenges. I have had occasion to work with humanitarian organizations. There can be honest mistakes. I have realized that there can be honest mistakes, isn't it? Because you guys are so busy trying to save lives. You don't have the privilege we have in the university. We can sit at a distance and look at you and say, no, what you're doing is wrong. You don't have that privilege. If you are working in the field, you just have to do something. The other thing is, and this is really critical, and I liked it that Dr. Goulet brought it up, the issue of data, the issue of research, the issue of information. If you work with centers, and I really like this, if you work with centers, you work with the universities, you will have a store for information that you can always refer back to. We did some work in 2008 with an organization, and one of my graduate students wanted to go back, and when she went, nobody in that organization could even remember that they did that kind of work, because they had already moved on. The funds they got for that project had dried up. The staff had already changed. They were completely new. But you see, for us in the university, we have libraries. We have even specialized libraries. Like in my university, we have a library a section for displacement and refugee studies only, where you can actually go and look for that. So that's another thing. But the other issues that come up over time that I want to ask, we have seen humanitarian action has moved from what it used to be, volunteerism, to professionalism. We are now professional humanitarian workers, isn't it? What does that carry with it? If you do political economy of humanitarian organizations in Kenya, you'll probably get an answer of what I'm saying. So I have a lot to say, but I was given only 10 minutes. I know I've passed, but thank you very much.
Many thanks, Professor. Now I'm going to give the microphone to my colleague Hamed Idris. You were speaking about volunteerism, so now we will have the speech from the largest volunteer-based network. And just some figures maybe to contextualize the Kenyan. Today, humanitarian action, following the State of Humanitarian Report, it's about $25 billion worldwide in 2017. And to give you an idea of the size of the different actors, the UN system, it's about 16 billions. The Red Cross movement, it's about 16.8. And the international NGOs, it's about also 16 billion USD. So you have those three groups of factors.
Great. In fact, that gives me a very good transition to the subject. When my colleagues briefed me on this topic, they gave me one instruction: to be as non-controversial as possible. And I responded and said, if humanitarian workers don't take the opportunity of an academic conference to be controversial, then we never get the opportunity to raise critical questions that we've been bothered. We always hide under the framework of neutrality and impartiality, not to ask the real questions. So first I want to put a caveat to say that what I will speak on may not necessarily be the policy position of the Kenya Red Cross on the issues that I will comment on. And that gives you an indication perhaps that I plan to be a bit controversial on the issues. So I've been asked to talk about locating the work of the Kenya Red Cross in the context of its operation, both as a local organization operating in an international humanitarian system. And I want to deliver our experience by bringing to your attention about three key issues, dichotomies, actually three key dichotomies that exist in the humanitarian system. The first dichotomy is the local versus international dichotomy that we're very much used to, and it comes up consistently in our conversation. There are local organizations, international organizations, local actors, international actors, and each comes with a different value sets, propositions, operations methods, and also gets attention on the basis of that categorization, local versus international. But more importantly, the global humanitarian system has a way of being able to have an international event totally influencing what happens in a totally unrelated part of the world. So look at humanitarian funding. You have Syria as a major humanitarian operation, and 9 months down the road, you can be certain that the funding flow to Kenya will reduce because there's a major crisis. So look at all major international disasters, whether it is the Ebola operations, the operations in Yemen, the operations in Syria. The first immediate impact is that when you have smaller local operations, the funding reduces. So for many organizations in Kenya, including the Kenya Red Cross, the last 5 years has been an experience of a decline in funding. And this decline in funding, but not necessarily because that the donors are not providing resources, but perhaps the donors are providing the resources to major humanitarian operations globally. So this is the first controversial dichotomy that exists and has had a serious impact on how we operate and do our work. The second dichotomy, and this is one that we've been stuck with, even when we've tried to make some meaningful impact, is the dichotomy between humanitarian relief and development. So there's a perception that perhaps they are development organizations, then they are relief organizations. And unfortunately, the Red Cross has the most dubious badge of being classified as a relief organization everywhere we go. In fact, it is so terrible that every time we speak about our development projects, the audience gets shocked. And so a few weeks ago, I had a discussion with one of our colleagues in the UN, and I was talking about a project we did in Bomet, which is an urban water development project, serving between 50,000 and 70,000 households. And the shock on his face was, I thought you only engage in disaster response, meaning the relief, we save lives, and so on. So this particular dichotomy itself has had an impact because whenever we seek funding, the first question is, are you known more for relief and humanitarian or for development projects? And it's a dichotomy that is extremely controversial in different sets, which I will speak about later on. The third dichotomy, and perhaps this is the most undemocratic dichotomy ever, is the North-South divide. So we have a controversial political organization globally that has an impact on how the humanitarian system operates. So we have organizations from the South and then organizations from the North. And almost normally, the function distribution is that those in the South are donors, those in the North, in the North are donors, those in the South are recipients, those in the North make the decisions, those in the South implement the decisions. Extremely undemocratic system, so to speak. But there is nowhere where this dichotomy has had more impact than in the humanitarian funding landscape. And so Virginie talked about the 2017 data on funding. And I'll give you just a few highlights to show how perverted the system is in terms of our own operation. So for that year, 2017, an average of $27.3 billion used for humanitarian response. Very good. That shows that, by the way, there was an increase from the previous years. So funding from the donor seems to be increasing. But here is the problem. 9% of the funding, it's only 9% of that total funding that comes from private actors, meaning that the rest are related to governments and public agencies, including international organizations. But the problem further is, it's 3 of the largest governments that accounted for 59% of the total donations. And if you have worked in the humanitarian system, I don't need to tell you who the 3 of the largest governments are. Now the perversion starts. Of the entire funding, 60% of all direct government funding went to multilateral institutions such as the UN. By the way, let it go on record, I have no problem with the UN. And I am specifically tempted to mention that because Trophy, who will be speaking on behalf of OCHA, is my neighbor. And I want to maintain the good neighborliness, even outside this conference. So 60% of the funding goes to multilateral institutions. And this is the impact, by the way, of that. National institutions are not considered multilateral institutions. So it is not going to national institutions. But 20% of the funding goes to NGOs. At least 20% is a very good figure. But look at what happens to the 20%. 94% of it goes to INGOs. By the way, remember, in 2015, we promised to be sending more funding to local NGOs, local organizations, under the localization agenda. But this 94% actually shows that it is an increase from the previous year. The previous year, that is 2016, it is 85% of the funding that went to NGOs that went to INGOs. So perhaps we're having reverse commitments. We commit to have more local, but we're increasing in the international. But here is where the problem lies. Of the remaining amount, local and national NGOs received only 0.4% of the total funding directly. Now, if that is not a problem, I don't know what problems look like generally. And so perhaps I'll make a few comments on why national organizations such as the Kenya Red Cross find that system problematic. 3 reasons. One, we are the most local organization that you can get, volunteer-based, possibly in every corner of this country. But the funding goes to organizations who, for them to implement work, have to find local partners. So this is, in fact, within the Red Cross system, the way this works is the international donor gives funding to a system that we call the partner national societies, which are usually national societies, Red Cross societies of the North. They receive that funding. They give it mostly to the International Federation of the Red Cross. The International Federation of the Red Cross take us through a process as local national societies on accessing the funding which we can implement. Imagine the bureaucracy that comes with it. Imagine the loss of time. And most importantly, the loss of resources associated with the bureaucracy. So the local international dichotomy is the most problematic context issue for national organizations such as the Kenya Red Cross. But the other one is the development humanitarian one. So organizations such as Kenya Red Cross, who have tried to work both in relief humanitarian context and development context, have the pain of juggling between these systems, different tool sets, different approaches, different mindsets, different expectations from donors, which is extremely problematic. And that has the risk of stretching what we do and how we do it. Have you noticed up to now, I've not given you any solutions, only problems. I'm hoping that we can have that conversation on the solutions in the plenary session. So my final comment is, if we were asked, make a summary of the context in which you operate, we will have 3 ways of describing it. It is ineffective, undemocratic, and unrepentant. And that is where the problem is. Thank you.
Many thanks, Idris. Now we are going to move to the presentation of Mr. Peter Haley. So Peter, you are really specialized in nutrition. You have been 27 years in the sector, and you have worked in many of the organizations mentioned by Idris, so the UN system, also international NGOs, and also linked to academia. So now you are going to explain us this humanitarian transition through the nutrition example.
Okay, good morning. First, a couple of caveats. I was asked to talk about the transition of a civil society in Kenya. I wasn't brave enough to do that in 10 minutes. So my colleagues here who are members of the civil society in the discussion, I really hope that you can bring out your perspectives. And secondly, even though I've been here for 14 years and I run a local organization, I'm still a guest in Kenya. So it's very difficult for me to be able to present, as Idris was saying, the Kenyan perspective of civil society in how it's changed over the years. So I look to some of my colleagues here also to bring that into the discussion. So I decided to talk about something that I could talk about and that I had experience of, which is about the way that the humanitarian nutrition or emergency nutrition programs in Kenya have changed or transitioned in the last 15 years, 20 years. So is there a, who's here? Sorry. Is that one? So in nutrition and health, we use these building blocks for a way of describing how we work and what we work on. I'm not going to lecture you on the building blocks of the health system. I'm just putting it up here to give you an idea of one of the main transitions that I feel that we've experienced in the last 15 to 20 years in Kenya, in that we've gone from being a sector as nutrition, emergency nutrition, from focusing in a very vertical sense to taking on a systems approach to the way that we work in Kenya, the way we work with the governments and the way we work with our clients or our beneficiaries in Kenya. This is a huge change that was very painful for many, and still is a long way to go in understanding what the difference is between the siloed approach and the systems approach, particularly for humanitarian-oriented organizations. Am I going the wrong way? There's a slide missing somewhere. The second one is about the 3 S's. So the 3 S's are a model that we use to look at how we're progressing in emergency nutrition. So the first one is substitution. And in 2006, I picked that year mostly because that's the year that I arrived in Kenya, but also it's the year where we saw from the professor's presentation in 2005 there was quite a big drought, and in 2006 there was quite a lot of floods. So it was one of those shocks on Kenya, but also on the system, to rethink. Once we came out of those 2 main emergencies, we had to rethink what we were doing, because we learned a lot about the mistakes we made. And in 2006, we were substituting for the ministries, for the communities, and for the districts. As NGOs, international NGOs, and as the UN, we were pretty much 90% substituting for the role of Kenyans in whichever part of the formal or informal system that responds to emergencies. We had about 2%, what did I put? 12% support. My family always teased me that I pick percentages out, so it's definitely a pick out and a guess. It's not really from evidence. About 12% of it was supporting, and that involved having someone from the UN who would regularly support the Department of, or the unit of nutrition in the Ministry of Health, or would regularly support the districts or the provinces. And a very small amount, why does it say 35% strengthening? It seems to have got mixed up in the email. A very small amount on strengthening, whatever the balance is there. That means a difference between having a TA based in the Ministry of Health or in the districts or in the provinces, and someone coming from a UNICEF office, which was my job at the time, to go and organize a meeting, organize a training, organize the coordination, write the minutes for the coordination, and those types of things. In 2019, we have very little substitution. Most of the substitution involves the question of financing of the activities of the health and nutrition sector. Everything from financing of coordination meetings, paying for the per diems and the people coming, the transport for people to come to meetings, to the paying for the supplies for the nutrition program. We have a lot more support with a lot more focus on being a step behind the formal and informal structures of Kenya in the way that we respond to an emergency, but also in the way that we do nutrition within the health system. And a lot of focus on strengthening. What does that mean? Just taking some of the building blocks. In 2006, the international partners led all of the meetings, led all of the coordination. You may have had particularly exceptional government staff or exceptional people within the UN, the NGOs, who led from a Kenyan perspective. But in terms of the day-to-day management of coordination, leadership and governance of the emergency nutrition response, it was an international partner-led program. What we have now is a fully government-led program with support from the international partners for strengthening leadership and governance. There's still a lot of work to do, but it has been a significant and positive change. Some of you here will have worked in a ACF or MSF or Save the Children feeding center in 2006. You will remember that the feeding center was next door to the health facility with a tent or a disused building, or often the cholera center converted to a nutrition center with 10 or 15 or maybe 5 or 10 nurses employed by the NGO or by the UN working in that center. And just 10 or 15 meters away was the government health clinic where you were lucky if you could find one nurse. We had the same situation when we would go to the provincial capitals or the district capitals or the national capital in terms of the people who were employed to coordinate, organize, lead, do the supplies. All aspects of the program were international partner contracts. Nowadays, it's very rare to find a contract from an international partner for health workers at the local levels, and most of the contracts through international partners are in the sense of a strengthening support to government systems and to community systems. We had separate information systems. The government knew nothing about what was happening during the emergency. The numbers of children that were admitted, the nutrition surveys that were done, the numbers of children who died, the numbers of people that were reached, none of that data was in the control or even on the desk of the government at the local or the national level. Nowadays, we have combined information systems. There are still, for various reasons, a variety of information systems, but the people who have the control over that information, to use that information, to analyze it, and what is said about that information is now the national and local levels of government. Supply chains. One of the big issues about an emergency response in nutrition, like it is for many other sectors, is the size and cost of the supply chain. And we have moved from a UN-organized supply chain to a government-organized system for nutrition. What we haven't moved from is a government-financed system for the nutrition products. Okay. Why did this transition happen? So some of it was, as the professor was saying, there are shocks, political shocks, and global shocks on the system that make a change in the way that we work. Some of the political issues that were mentioned before also had a direct impact on emergency nutrition sector. Also, we have some incredible individuals from all areas who made the decision and put into place a system that made this successful transition happen, and some of you are here today. At the base, I'm a civil society person from a French NGO tradition. This next point really hurts me in that the transitions, the positive transitions that happened are, when we look back, are mostly government and donor led. In my opinion, and in several of the participatory workshops, we've identified where the points of transition happened within the emergency nutrition programming, and the vast majority of them are a result of donors or the government saying you must change. And for me, this is a big disappointment for those of us who are civil society oriented, that it's not coming from, especially the international NGOs, to make these changes happen. Then there's been technical improvements, IT technical improvements, methods and protocols that we use have made it a lot easier to be decentralized and to be, for the government and the informal parts of governance at the community level, to manage the program. There's another list of droughts. those of us who've been here since the 2005-2006 drought will remember that every time, about 2 months, 3 months after the droughts, we come into a meeting room like this and we have an evaluator come at the front and tell us that we responded late, that we didn't respond in the right way, we didn't work with local communities, we didn't work with local NGOs. Every single time we have pretty much the same evaluation results coming out. So that was the negative way of looking at it. But what I've seen also is every time we have those evaluation results, there is a response from the system to make change. And over that time, we have positively changed. And some of those changes are what has created this transition for nutrition. Devolution has had a huge impact on the way that civil society works in Kenya. And it's still ongoing, still we're learning how to do it. There's many negatives, but in the places, in the arid lands, there's very many positives for health and nutrition. The change to a lower middle income country for Kenya in particular, for the question of funding and what the donors are looking for, has put tremendous, let's call it evolutionary pressure on the nutrition sector, but also on the international partners and local partners to start to see how they can change to a new funding environment and new expectations from the government and from the donors. Resilience has had a huge impact. The ideas of resilience and the way we try to change our programs to address resilience. And then using Nexus in a different sense, although still connected to this, what did you call it? The paradox of humanitarian and development. Emergency nutrition in Kenya, quite uniquely in the region, has kind of seems to have just slipped by this discussion about how we link humanitarian and development, whether you're a humanitarian nutritionist or a development nutritionist. And my personal feeling is that the way that has happened is through this systems thinking. Rather than thinking about, is this an emergency malnourished child or is this a development malnourished child? Is this a child that is malnourished because of the drought? Or is this a child because malnourished because of the underdevelopment in Turkana? The emergency nutrition people, organizations, funding have all come around the idea of the building blocks as systems, health systems approach to how do we respond to emergency increases in the number of malnourished children. Since this change in 2012, we've had a smallish drought in 2014, a big one in 2016, 2017, and one in 2019. When you look at the funding and the roles and work of the international partners through those droughts, you will see that there is a significant change in the way that they work. And if you see it as a pyramid, there haven't been any significant times when the government has said, we cannot do this. There haven't been any significant times where there are massive amounts of emergency funding that come in and duplicate the development funding and the resilience funding for nutrition. So a transition has happened in the nexus in nutrition without too much of a discussion about whether you're a humanitarian or a development nutritionist. I think that's the end of my... Oh, 1 minute. Do I need to say anything about that? What in the future? So, as with all of these transitions, it comes down to money. And in the future, the issue is going to be that the lower to middle income country status means that by next year, there will be no more money for nutrition in the health system. This will leave a discussion about how do we finance IUTF, the specialist food products and the specialist products for nutrition, and how do we finance all of these processes of strengthening that are still incomplete within the health system. How do we reduce the TA? One of the very rightful complaints about international partners is they just adapt, they never leave. So we've done success in adapting. Are we ever going to leave? As some of the previous speakers have mentioned, the big thing on the horizon is the increased impacts of climate change on malnutrition. How can this success in the government taking the lead, in the informal parts of governance taking the lead on the response to nutrition, how can it be also shock responsive? Yeah, and the ending of IP support to nutrition. I think that's definitely me finished. Thank you.
Thank you very much, Peter. So I think it was a great example of transitioning mechanism through the nutrition sector. Now I give the floor to Mrs. Trufosa-Njichi. I spell probably all the name wrong, but you will correct me afterwards. You are representing UN OCHA, Eastern Africa today. Please, you can start. So I can say you're specialized in international humanitarian law and disaster preparedness.
Okay. As you've heard, technology is not my strongest area. So anyway, thank you very much for this opportunity. I'd like to convey apologies from our head of office, Gemma Connell. She has had to respond to an important meeting in Zambia. We are launching the Zambia appeal as a result of the drought situation in the country, and her presence was needed there. So I'll try to fit into her shoes, but I hope we will also have an opportunity to just learn from each other based on my experience and maybe just the little information that I have on this subject matter. I have a lot to say, triggered by the previous speakers, speaking on behalf of the UN OCHA. I'll speak specifically on behalf of an organization called OCHA, but I'll be touching a bit on other UN experiences. But I think I'll, in the interest of time, I'll restrict myself to the subject matter because I think I've been provoked a bit by the previous speakers, and I guess maybe we'll have follow-up conversations on some of the issues. But just to mention that in trying to reposition the importance of humanitarian coordination and humanitarian interventions in this region, I would like to say that humanitarian action and response remains a necessary catalyst towards effective response in the region. And as this conference intends to do, building strong partnerships based on mutual respect, trust, and confidence, and working together to strengthen humanitarian effectiveness will be the only way that we'll be able to collectively be able to help the people that we seek to reach. We are looking towards learning a bit more from the research institutes. I guess, as the professor said, they could be seeing things from a different angle that we are not seeing. So it will be very important to learn and to continue learning from the academia, research institute, religious institutions represented, CBOs, NGOs, and government institutions. So using our organization, OCHA, I'll share with you how the nature of the humanitarian architecture basically adapts and changes or transitions depending on various factors. Key factors that have informed the transition of the organization that I work for would include things like the humanitarian context. Depending on what the humanitarian context is, then we adapt and we adjust to be able to fit the response within some of the core functions that we handle. It also depends on the nature of the local and institutional capacity. How capacitated are the institutions and the structures on the ground that you can say now as the UN or now as the civil society, we need to move on and perform a different function. These are factors that inform a lot of the transition in the humanitarian context. And also in terms of just reaching out to the affected population, how well capacitated are the communities to be able to handle the issues that are affecting them, so that you can say, for this particular response, we are going to sort of pull out, or for this particular response, we are going to redirect our resources and our activities in a different direction. So for those of you who are hearing the word OCHA for the first time, somebody asked me out there, what is OCHA? I'll just give a brief background in 2 minutes, trying to restrict myself within the 10 minutes I've been given. I'll give you a brief background on what OCHA is. OCHA basically stands for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. The issue of coordination was brought up, coordination of humanitarian affairs. Are we doing better? I mean, almost how many years later, since 1991, are we doing better in terms of coordinating humanitarian affairs? Are organizations better as a result of this establishment of this organization? Are our people any better? These are some of the issues that we'll be grappling with during this session, just to see how we can better help each other to position ourselves within this ambit of humanitarian response. So OCHA basically stands for the Office for the Coordination of Humanitarian Affairs. Our mandate stems from the General Assembly, Resolution 46-182, so it's well positioned within the core functions of the United Nations. We are a secretariat office. We fall within one of the organs of the UN, the Secretariat Office, and we are basically the humanitarian arm of the United Nations. Those of you who know the functions of the Secretariat, basically you know it has different departments and different offices that support the functions of the Secretary General. OCHA handles the humanitarian affairs of that organ, the Secretariat. And what do we do? Basically, as a result of the events that happened during the Gulf War and the years around 1990, what happened during that response, we saw that everybody rushed in to respond, as sometimes is the nature of our responses. We are seeing better response right now. We are seeing better reaction right now. But at that point in time, disaster occurred and everybody jumped in. Everybody jumped in with their mandate, with their resources, with their capacities, with everything. And what emerged as a result, the evaluation that emerged, somebody has talked about lessons learned. What the evaluation that emerged out of that was that there was a lot of duplication of efforts, there was a lot of wastage of resources, and very little was done on the ground, yet the resources were available. It was as a result of this that the Secretary General, the UN Security Council the General Assembly, came up with a resolution that sought to strengthen the United Nations response to humanitarian disasters. That is how we came about. As a result of this, there are certain offices that were established. There was the office, because another thing that emerged during that response was that there was no leadership, because everybody came with their director, with their leader, and they were doing what they thought they should do according to their mandate. But then with this resolution, they established the position of the Emergency Relief Coordinator, who works with the Secretary General, and also they established the Interagency Standing Committee to provide guidelines on how humanitarian response should be conducted. This was all basically aimed at giving leadership to humanitarian response. And also, one thing that was also established at that point in time was what we called the SAF, the Central Emergency. Then it was called the Revolving Fund. Many of you who've engaged with OCHA during responses, especially in Kenya, you must have heard of the SAF appeals, you must have heard of the flash appeals. Right now, we've just secured, was it 5 million for the drought situation through the SAF. And these are some of the functions that OCHA does in this region, trying to mobilize resources to be able to to give that immediate, what they call the seed money, to be able to activate humanitarian response while humanitarian actors and governments are still mobilizing their resources. So that's one of the functions that we perform. That is what we do globally. Basically, we are guided by the humanitarian principles, the key ones being humanity, neutrality, impartiality, and independence. But we are also guided by the principle of diversity, trust, national and local ownership, what we are talking about, just making sure that you're able to augment national and local coordination capacities and being able to promote coordination structures that are complementary and are able to stand on their own should you choose to pack and go. We are also informed by the need for accountability to affected communities and gender equality. That is OCHA at the global level. At the regional level, we have offices that support our work. So to implement this whole mandate that is instituted through 46182, we have regional offices and country offices. Here we have a regional office that I work for. It's the regional office now called the Regional Office for Southern and Eastern Africa. I've been here long enough and the name has changed almost 4 times. And this is what I'm telling you, the transitions. The first regional office was established in 1996 here in Nairobi. And basically, it was when the crisis in DRC started. And the focus at that time was to deal with the Great Lakes region and to serve as the support structure of the UN Regional Humanitarian Coordinator for the Great Lakes region. And with the unfolding crisis in DRC and the neighboring countries, OCHA established field offices in almost all the countries of the Great Lakes except Tanzania. And this is how we work, basically. A crisis occurs, we move in. If there's need to establish an office, we establish an office. Once we manage to do the transition, we close the office and revert the services to the regional office. So this is what happened in 1996. We started with the support to the Great Lakes, region. OCHA's mandate, in addition to its original support structure, parallel to this, we established an office in Addis Ababa. That was the regional office. This is the time also the drought situation started in the Horn of Africa. Not really started. There was a drought situation in the Horn of Africa at the time. And at that point in time, Kenya was seen as a potential to be able to host this. So we established the Kenya office in 2000, and our focus at that point in time was to deal with the drought situation in the Horn of Africa. So we supported agencies to coordinate to the drought emergency in the region. Our support basically is more strategic because we are not an agency, we are not an operational agency on the ground. We give strategic guidance in terms of convening partners, both government and non-governmental, UN and non-UN agencies. We convene partners, bring them together, and what we do is now, having brought the partners together, we come to have an agreed sort of context analysis. We agree on the needs, we agree actually on the context first, and then we are able to identify the needs. Having identified the needs, we are able to identify who are the partners on the ground, what are their capacities, what can they do, and then we allow partners to go and implement these activities. All this is basically aimed at making sure that response to humanitarian crisis is streamlined and is done in a more coordinated and organized manner. So that was our regional office at the time, and then we established the Kenya office to be able to deal with the drought situation. And then another critical area that we got engaged in was the 2007 political crisis in Kenya. With the 2007 political crisis in Kenya, OCHA's role was instrumental in also convening partners through a number of forums. We work very closely with the government, and we work very closely with the Kenya Red Cross, which, as you know, is the first responder in this country. So led by the Kenya Red Cross, we were able to convene the UN partners, and also now came up with a forum where all partners would come together to identify the needs and set up the structure, the response mechanism that was necessary at the time. We were actively involved in the response to IDPs, supporting intersector refugee response and coordination at that time. We were actively positioned within the IDP camps, and we also helped to set up 8 coordination hubs. All this is being done in support and in coordination with the government and other partners. We do not work in isolation. We work basically to complement their functions. to complement their functions. So 8 coordination hubs were established, and through these hubs, information was able to be exchanged to the different areas that were affected, and people were informed of the evolving situation. As the needs diminished, needs now arising from the 2007 post-election violence, and this is now the nature of humanitarian response. As needs diminish, as the context changes, you also adapt. And when the coalition government came in, the government was able to set up structures that were able to deal with the IDP situation at the time, and also even now, they're the ones who are able to come up with that structure to deal with that. And also with the Kenya Red Cross stepping up, and I think it is also during this time that an agreement was reached in terms of how many people the Kenya Red Cross can address and for what period, while the rest of the agencies continued on their other operations and would only come in when the threshold for the Kenya Red Cross had been exhausted. Idris, you can support me on that one. I wasn't part of that, but it's a major point that was raised on this one. So it was also at this time that the regional drought in the Horn of Africa 2011 also was experienced, and OCHA's role and function was shifted to supporting the government and partners on coordination of the drought-related issues through the Kenya Humanitarian Partnership Team. So this is a forum that we established within the OCHA offices together with the resident coordinator to basically bring partners together to discuss the emerging humanitarian needs. And meanwhile, as we were doing all this, OCHA also continued to support, we set up what we call the HART, the Humanitarian Response Teams. We set up one in Dadaab in northeastern Kenya to be able to support the host community that had been affected by the drought at that time. Because what happened was most people moved near refugee camps during the drought, most people in that region, to be able to access services. But then when the situation started changing, some of them were unable to return, and OCHA was requested to support the coordination of the host community interventions, while UNHCR focused on refugee support. We continued with this until now this agreement was reached, and a lot of these functions were moved back to the government. As we did this humanitarian response, because it seems like you're just in action on humanitarian response, at the same time, we were working with the government in trying to set up the necessary structures that would take over these functions. It is during this time that discussions and a lot of policies were coming into place to be able to establish the National Disaster Management Authority and the National Disaster Operations Center, which we continue to work closely with, because now they've basically taken over a lot of these functions, with the NDOC, the Disaster Operational Center, handling sudden onset situations like the election issues, and the NDMA basically continuing to handle the drought-related and long-term issues affecting mainly the arid and semi-arid areas. What other functions are we doing in the region? As I mentioned, the issue of resource mobilization, that has been a big one for us in terms of just making sure that partners have the funds that are required to be able to respond as and when they are called to. Being in Kenya, has that been an advantage? Yes, of course it has been an advantage, knowing very well Kenya's critical role in basically brokering peace in this region, and also just being that hub that many actors are using to be able to respond. Our presence here has been very, very critical in making sure that we are able to monitor closely what is happening in the region compared to the response that we are seeing. As I mentioned, as a regional office, we are responding to 25 countries. And you can imagine, I mean, how difficult that would be. But our being based here, having a regional office here, has ensured that proximity, we are able to reach out to the partners, to reach out to the government when a disaster strikes in this region, and it has been able to ensure that the response is effective and as prompt as necessary. Currently, having transitioned and allowed the government to, because now the Kenya office was closed, with the emergence and with the capacity at the local level, with local capacities being strengthened, we closed the Kenya office, and that function was transferred back to the regional office. So it's part of it, it's considered as one of the 25 countries that we are supporting, and basically we continue to give operational support in terms of operational preparedness, contingency planning through the established government structures. Okay, so some thoughts. I mean, this is a panel discussion, so I'm just going to throw out some points for consideration. That is a bit just the background on OCHA and what we are doing and how we are moving forward. But in terms of just bringing this back to our discussion for today, and as we said, we are here to learn from each other and to support each other and to be able to just make sure that our interventions remain relevant and are able to meet the needs of the people that we serve. Some areas that we can maybe focus on would be as we look at OCHA and other UN agencies in this region. Can we say that our people are better? Are our people any better by having all these agencies here, having this response here? Can we say, what are your thoughts on that? Do you think our people are any better in terms of accessing assistance when disaster strikes and even thereafter? Do you have any suggestions? Can we together come up with any suggestions that can make the lives of our people better? Are our systems better capacitated? I hope we still have a few, the government representatives. I understand we have government representatives here. Do we feel that our systems are better capacitated to be able to handle the scope and severity of disaster when it arises? Of course, I'm not expecting the government to stand up and say, no, we cannot, but how can we support one another to be able to make sure that our systems and our structures are better capacitated? What are some of the loopholes that we can together fill to be able to make sure that this works out for the betterment of our people? And what do we feel can be done in terms of ensuring that we are better prepared? Early action, early warning, contingency planning structures. How can we work together as we transition from using humanitarian actors to more of government involvement, to more of local community engagement, to more of using the local organizations? How can we make sure that some of these systems are well prepared and well capacitated to handle this? I'll stop there and invite your responses. So thank you very much.
So many thanks. I think it is the first time in my life that we are at a minute just like planned. So, which is great because the idea is really to give space to the discussion. So, François, before we open the discussion, would you like to say a few words?
Yes, thank you very much. Yeah, allow me to challenge you a little bit to kick off the discussions. My usual impression when discussing with humanitarians is that humanitarians spend a lot of time justifying themselves, what they do, how they operate, how they are funded, and so on and so forth. Yet, humanitarians do not work for themselves, and they're there to serve the public. And I would like to hear you a little bit more about the challenges that you are facing, and basically, what are the things, we've heard a lot about the things that you are doing. I'd like to hear a little bit more about the things that you are not doing, and the things that you could be doing, or the things that you don't manage to do yet, and basically, better collaboration with policymakers, with international organizations, or with researchers could help you work better. In a way, so I'd like you to invite you to take a step back and basically try and look at what you are not yet doing and what you would like to be doing. I think this needs to relate also to the evolving needs of the people in the region, and clearly the development progress of Kenya and of the region over the last decades must have changed humanitarian action quite significantly. Kenya now appears as a relatively advanced country in the region. And so the question would also be, what lessons can Kenya teach, in a way, to other countries in the region, especially to those affected by very dire humanitarian crises, such as South Sudan, for example, or Eritrea? And basically, what kind of lessons can be taken from the case of Kenya to help those much dire humanitarian situations in the region?
I'll attempt a response based on my area of engagement as an organization, because I think a lot of what you've raised are very valid questions and valid considerations for any organization that seeks to be progressive. And I think the response to this depends on the mandate of a particular organization. What is your mandate? What have you been cut out to do? So, like if I was to speak for the organization that I work for, OCHA, our mandate is basically, the core function is to do coordination, is to ensure that humanitarian partners are brought together to be able to respond effectively. Have we been able to achieve that fully? Have we been able to achieve that function? We have 5 other core functions: information management, advocacy, as I said, resource mobilization. But the main mandate that we were established to do was to coordinate humanitarian action. How has that worked in the past and even now, and where are we going with coordination? It has not been easy, because as you know, effective coordination depends mainly on how you manage people. Mm-hmm. Much as it's a General Assembly resolution, much as you have the leadership at the Secretary General and the Secretary General level, it depends on how you manage people. It's basically informed by trust, it's basically informed by issues of transparency, and it's basically informed by issues to do with what's your value added to my work. The main challenge we have faced in the past, are there any donors here? Are there any donors?
Yep, at least one.
Okay. Please don't cut your funding to watch after I say this. This is my personal opinion. I think a main challenge that we were facing in the past, let me qualify that, the main challenge that we were facing in the past was that one of the main reasons that we were brought together and one of the main reasons that we were asked to coordinate was to make sure that we are able to mobilize resources as a unit. That's why it was called the consolidated appeal process. We were able to mobilize resources as a unit. But what we saw and what we have seen, and this is just the reality of the world that we operate in, informed by political reasons, informed by social reasons, informed by economic interests, certain people will be funded unilaterally. If I can get my money unilaterally, why do I need to be part of a coordination forum? If I have my own mandate, if I can do I have my own structure, why do I need to be part of a coordination forum? That has been a main challenge for the longest time with the coordination space. And what have we done about it? What we've done about it is to try and also just leverage with the donors, and also just to be able to leverage, because as I speak about coordination, not every person participates in the coordination forum. Certain people choose to go independently. But over the years, initially it was a problem, because when everybody was doing their own thing, then it was a problem. But over the years, we have managed through this whole strategic framework and also just bringing partners together, we have managed to be able to show, I didn't bring a list of specific examples, but we have been able to show these partners that we will get more if we work together as opposed to going it alone. And also just working with our donors and working with other partners and governments also, we have been able to show them the value added in ensuring that we can work together. Because it's not just about the money, it's not just about going out there and responding. It's about also being able to have a common understanding of what we are doing. It's also about the accountability to the affected people. Because if you're going it alone and you're going out there and messing, what does it reflect to the affected people? So that has been a major challenge for those of us who are in coordination. But by and by, as I said, depending on your mandate, because for us, it's coordination and it's also capacity building for the local actors and the national actors to be able to stand on their own. We have seen this happening. Is it where we would want it to be entirely? Not quite. But we continue to collaborate with them in making sure that that is where we are going. So thank you.
Yes.
For me, the answer to the question is about what we mean by transition. And I've been doing quite a few workshops and participatory work on what do we mean by transition. And there seems to be like 2 different ways of thinking about it. One is that it's a transition from where we are now to an objective, an endpoint. And the second is that it's a change. It's a change process with no end. When you look at the successes that we've had as humanitarian organizations in the last 10 years, many of those, in my opinion, many of those successes are within our system. We've drastically changed how we deal with food security by moving from large-scale food distributions to cash transfers and vouchers and those types of things. We've drastically changed how we coordinate. We've, in many, many different ways, we've changed how we work as a system. What we haven't changed is what our objective is. And quite often it would appear that we find it very difficult to change so that our objective is, and we've stated it in the Humanitarian Summit, it's stated in all of the UN resolutions and whatever their names are, that our objective is that it is Kenya, in this case, or Somalia or South Sudan, who will be able to take the responsibility and accountability to respond to humanitarian needs. So just to sum up, how do we now move forward on localization in its broad sense? How do we move forward in a place like Somalia, being in meetings, being in justifications that it has to be done like this because of humanitarian principles, or because the government doesn't have the capacity, or because of insecurity, to how do we change what we're doing to move towards our ultimate objective is that the Somali people themselves, or the Kenyan people themselves, are accountable and responsible for the response. And I don't think that needs to wait until you're in a good position like Kenya is right now in a country like Somalia and South Sudan. Thank you.
Thanks. A quick follow-up question maybe before I move to you. I think that you raised an important point on what defines transition and how we conceptualize transition. And to me, this very much relates to the question of what defines success. Is success that a humanitarian crisis is addressed effectively, or is success the fact that the humanitarian crisis does not materialize? In a way, we could imagine that the transition of the humanitarian sector would be walking towards the disappearance of the humanitarian sector itself, and by transitioning from a reactive approach of addressing crises when they occur towards a more proactive approach, which would be towards avoiding the crisis to materialize in the first place. And I think this is a kind of challenging issue when we discuss the transition of the humanitarian sector, especially in a place like Kenya.
So the irony is, at least the way I was taught, the work of humanitarian agencies is to make themselves irrelevant over a period of time. So you can imagine someone whose task is to work towards not having a job. And that's a difficult objective to achieve. And as Peter said, we work consistently towards adapting, not living. So we move from addressing one crisis to finding another responsibility as a product or byproduct of the crisis. And this is one of the biggest challenges. But the overall answer is, if we truly remain committed to the objective of the work that we do, which is to build resilience of communities overly. And from building resilience of communities is just the ability to become irrelevant in that context. So the ability of a community to be able to anticipate a disaster, to be able to avoid, the preventive mechanisms, and most importantly, to be able to address the impact on their own. I think that is the core objective. I don't think we can have a system in which we prevent, risks entirely. The question is what the multiple strategies that we put in place to be able to deal with that. And so among the things, maybe to just come to your first question, that we might not be doing very well as humanitarian system is appreciating the primacy of the public authorities in the work that we do. So the primary role of governments, both at local level and at national level. And so, and this is, in my view, Peter, this has been a particular challenge of the civil society generally, to have meaningful engagement with public authorities, to make them as key partners, and not just partners, as entities that have the primary responsibility of dealing with the context we operate. And so that's one area that we're not doing very well. The second part is whenever we talk about locating our work within communities, making it community-centric, we tick on boxes, of public participation, but we're not necessarily making them community-centric, meaning let the community design their own interventions, let the communities participate in implementing their own intervention, and perhaps consider our role as facilitators within a value chain of resource distribution. And that's another major weakness. And the final one that I think is quite weak for us is the value for money concept. I think we're not really honest on whether we can achieve more with the resources we have, whether we're getting the correct value for the resources that are entrusted to us. And if we get these three questions right, then we'll be better placed.
Thank you. Some questions from the audience, maybe?
I think we'll take the question from the audience now.
Good morning. I'm Jean-Baptiste from ACTED. So I think Kenya's classification to a middle-income country in 2014 has been a turning point from a humanitarian donor point of view. These donors now expect the government to respond to the needs of its population. Unfortunately, 5 years after this ranking, key systems in Kenya are not fully functional due to rapidly growing population, but also misallocation of human and financial resources and declining in public expenditures. By 2050, there'll be 90 million Kenyans. And by the year 2100, there'll be 135 million. But as of today, 41% of Kenyans rely on unimproved water sources and 59% on unimproved sanitation solutions. On top of this, we have more than 3 million people in serious food insecurity. So to conclude, it's very hard to position and navigate around as a humanitarian actor, as we can't work business as usual. We must support the building of the national and county government response capacity, as well as increasing the partnerships with the local civil society and the private actors. But also, we can't turn a blind eye to the unmet needs that we observe in some part of the countries. Thank you.
There was one at the back. Yes, I have a mic over here. I suggest we start with the back. The gentleman was the first one, and then we move to the front, and then we'll switch to the other side of the aisle.
My name is Steven Wanjala from MSF France. I think I'll address the question to Idris and Peter because they touched on the issue I want to ask. So one of the dichotomies that you talked about, Idris, is the dichotomy of funding and how local organizations do not quite get a big share or a significant share of the funding. But when you look at Africa and as an emerging economy, for example, Nigeria with 200 million people, if you take 1% of those as millionaires, I mean dollar millionaires, you have about $2 million millionaires in Nigeria. Kenya, 50 million people, also with it's not a very small size of dollar millionaires. We also have a big emerging population of middle class. And yet, when we look at the humanitarian space and the contribution of these really wealthy Africans to financing humanitarian action, it's really lacking. And I mean, I would dare to ask the question, if you remove the financing from the Western donors, will there be a sufficient and effective humanitarian action in Kenya or in Africa? And my opinion is no, that we, maybe as civil society actors, as local organizations, have failed. One of the places where we failed is to, I don't know, be able to mobilize local resources to change the culture. My second question is directed to the OCHA representative. And I mean, we are moving towards giving more responsibility to government in terms of mounting a humanitarian response. Whereas in my, maybe, I don't know, maybe it's my own experience, interaction with government, I find that very often what inspires humanitarian action is blood when you're having that conversation. That what inspires humanitarian action is the need to relieve the human suffering. But often in your interactions with government, you get the sense that the conversation starts with what's my sitting allowance, what's my per diem, what's my, I mean, the budgets that we get when we are responding to humanitarian action is, I mean, something that I could do with 1 million Kenya shillings is 10 million Kenya shillings, and the 9 million Kenya shillings really is per diems. Sorry to any government officials who are here, but I think as humanitarian actors, we have to be able to confront this more strongly to change this culture, because it's basically you're dealing with minds that are corrupt, and if you're not able to change that mindset, I do not see then how are you transitioning all this humanitarian responsibility to government without changing the mindset will really lead to a sustainable solution or even an effective humanitarian response.
Thank you. Difficult question. I've also experienced myself many times this challenge of the city allowance and the per diem and the pain in the head that it is. A question at the front here.
Well, let me begin by just appreciating the submissions from the bench, because they speak quite a bit to the only extended experience I've had in the humanitarian sector, which I thought I should throw in here. And that is precisely the reality that as academics, some of us here are academics, it has been possible to theorize and create a framework model for working together in the humanitarian sector. And personally, my big experience was at the epicenter of the Boko Haram in Maiduguri in northeastern Nigeria. And in spite of that theory, the reality seems to me to be what the representative from OCHA is saying, that due to a lot of vested interests, a lot of NGOs, INGOs coming with their own mandates, it was virtually impossible to get them to work together. That is something, you can read all about it in Chapter 4 of Nigeria's Human Development Report of 2018. But there's a really framework model that helps us to unpack the nexus. So in short, I'm saying, is there room for theorizing and improving and creating a better model for humanitarian action? Because the experience seems to be that the ground rejects it for all manner of reasons. Lastly, of course, there's something that lawyers would call state-triggered complicity for failure. And this too has been my worry, because I appreciate very much the UN resolutions, because they guide us. But there's also the reality that I don't want to go into too much, that we put too much state sovereignty as the main vehicle for implementing action. And of course, you end up in Kenya, for instance. I know that some of the losses during humanitarian interventions could directly be traced to state-triggered complicity in the failure. Thank you very much.
Thank you. Maybe we'll give a chance to the panel to answer these questions with obviously a central theme, which is the relationship with the public authorities and how to work better with them. And then we'll move to the other side of the aisle.
So maybe I can start with the colleague from MSF directed a question to me. Look, so I agree with you. I think from a giving perspective, majority of the funds comes from the north. That really doesn't mean that the people in the south are not contributing to addressing vulnerability in their own systems. So I'll give you an example. If you study the economy of the societies that we live in, we run what normally is referred to as social economies, the relationship between myself and my brother, my cousin, my uncle, and so on. So a lot of the giving that is happening is giving within family and community context. That is why in many places, even after disaster strike, the numbers of people displaced is still minimal because they're absorbed within communities, they're cared for within communities, and they're provided for the resources that they did at least to provide the period, to survive the period of emergencies at the community level. So your society, you and I, are already providing resources, just that perhaps we've not organized ourselves sufficiently to put it into organized humanitarian systems. And maybe at one point in time we'll get there. So the Kenya Red Cross program, the next 5 years, we want to strengthen on individual giving at a national level so that we receive more from people who are in the country. But I agree with you that it's still quite a challenge. My colleague from ACTED made a very good comment that we really need to debate as humanitarian agencies and as humanitarian workers. What is the overall impact on Kenya's classification as a lower middle income country? And that invites you to get into an area that we rarely participate in. What is our perspective and our contribution to economic development in the country? Do we meaningfully contribute to that discourse? I'll give you an example. This country right now, if you do a summary, an analysis of the economic policies of the country, we are working towards a model that improves efficiency of the economy. Okay? And a model that improves efficiency of the economy, the key indicators, investments on infrastructure, investment in the financial sector, improvement in the financial sector and financial services. All that contributes to only people who already have capital. And that is where the perversion of the system lies. Majority of the people who are in need, who are vulnerable, who are young, don't own capital. And we're operating in an economic system that is only focusing on those who have capital. So imagine if we had a say in that. Imagine if we held public discourse to show how an economic system is contributing to increasing vulnerability, even when the overall view on it shows that it is improving. That is the kind of conversation that we need to participate in. But you know why we don't participate in it? We classify that discussion as political. We give it a banner called controversial, and then we lose the opportunity to have a meaningful impact to the communities that we serve. That's not the position of the Kenya Red Cross, by the way. It's my own position again. Thank you.
Okay, maybe I can respond to the other two questions that were directed to me. And I'll start with the MSF one about our engagement with the government and why that should be monitored even more closely. Because as you know, and I think I didn't get your name, but as was mentioned here, the primary responsibility for the protection and assistance of citizens lies with the government under which they subscribe. OCHA and other UN agencies and humanitarian actors only come in with the consent of the government, at the invitation of the government to assist. This is not to say, as was mentioned, that you're going to use the concept of sovereignty to deny assistance where it is necessary. It's in respecting this principle of sovereignty and territorial integrity that we work with governments to make sure that they retain that primary responsibility and primary role of assisting their citizens. So we only come in where the government is either unable or unwilling or has called for support to come and be assisted. And as you will know, having been in the field, this has been the trend. So as we are giving that humanitarian assistance, which is just the life-saving assistance to be able to help people who've been affected, we are also making sure that we work towards moving to more permanent solutions, the development assistance and all that, and the resilience building with governments, so that they are well capacitated to be able to take over their functions. So this is, and I think you also mentioned it, that our work is not to come in and maintain the status quo and keep people in that state of need and begging and all that. No. It may have protracted in certain situations, but that's not the objective of any agency that comes to respond. Our objective is to make sure that as we come in, we leave people better than we found them, if not in the same situation that they were. On the issue that you raised, which is very, very critical, what inspires humanitarian action seems to be blood. I will talk on behalf of humanitarian organizations that what inspires us to action and what informs and guides our actions are the humanitarian principles. Do we always follow these humanitarian principles? It's an open debate out there. Can you say humanitarian actors are impartial? Are they neutral? Are they following on humanity? Can they be trusted? Because it will be really unfair to live here saying that governments are inspired by PADM and all those things, yet within our own organizations, we are now conducting investigations to be able to address some of these issues. And this is open out there. So the issue of the inspiration to engage in humanitarian activity and how you handle it, I want to believe every organization has mechanisms to be able to handle this. When a corruption allegation arises, for instance, how do you deal with it? When you go into these government forums and you're saying in government forums, or even in normal forums where you go and you're saying your first discussion, the preamble is, what is my PADM? You, as a person who's inspired by different intentions, what is your action? Because I'll throw this back to ourselves when you're talking about accountability frameworks. Because if you continue giving, and if you continue giving me, this is now me as Trufosa, not Trufosa as the UN, then I will continue asking. But if you put mechanisms that will be able to block this and focus me on the main issue at hand, to be able to respond and to reach the affected people, I know, I can see people moving up and down saying you have no idea what you're going through. No. But as long as we continue to encourage it, then it remains. But as when we go out and preach the principles that we rely on, when you go out and show people the value added in your response, I think it will bring a difference in the way we do our work. Is it easy? No, it's not easy, but it's something that we can address. We have a lot of accountability frameworks that are in place right now, and some of these things are being dealt with. What was the other issue? You want to jump in?
I
Okay.
can help you.
Mm-hmm.
I mean, I agree with a lot of what you've said, but I'd just like to point out that that discussion about government being like this and others, international partners being like that, is again going back into this discussion of us and them. And I've worked a lot in recently, for instance, in Turkana, visiting the most vulnerable households in Turkana, seeking them out and interviewing them. At the point of dying within the few hours of meeting them. And I've met as many committed people in the government or in the local NGOs or in the communities as I've met in my nearly 30 years of working in humanitarian organizations. And part of our problem, and we've seen it very clearly in Somalia, part of our problem is that we as a system, as a humanitarian system, we see the people that we interact with without all of the great words that you mentioned, without enough looking about how we can trust each other, without looking enough at how we can see what the benefit is of working with the other people and what we gain from those things. So I think we have to be really careful. I understand, and I've been exactly in the same position as my colleague from MSF. We have to be very careful in using generalizations about the government is corrupt. As my colleague said, the international partners are not corrupt. That's not true in a general sense. And we have to be very careful about how we position ourselves when we're talking about what we want to do in the future.
One question. Is there an economist in the room? So you see, so I will give you two tracks. Following the question of MSF. I think one of the problems of the humanitarian sector is to analyze itself as such and not collect it broader. If you take, for example, the flood in Pakistan, we know that now ODA, Overseas Development Aid, is about $145 billion in 2017. But we know that international monetary transfers have nothing compared. They are much, much bigger. So now when you have a flood in Pakistan, the money flooding from international Pakistan community, actually it's much more important than international aid. So now it would be much more interesting maybe that some economists just study the whole economy on how the whole money is mobilized worldwide for a flood in Pakistan. So then maybe we can make the bondage and links between the different flows of funding, how it's coordinated, how it interlinks. Second, I think that I have more chance with the sociologist in the room. Yeah, Marie-Thérèse Menge, professor, is here, so I speak on your behalf. At the foundation, we had one theory problem talking about theorization, is the one of what sociologists called social bonds, is what makes, and it's what relates to what you say, Idris, is when a person goes through a crisis, what are all the social dynamics of community, churches, work, family, friends, clubs that help you stay strong. Now, actually, the theories between social bonds in one country or one community and the link with international community is not done. So we are really looking at people also who would be motivated, because actually when you are in a community, let's say northern Nigeria, and suddenly a crisis happens, how suddenly when you have international people coming in, how does it interconnect socially with already existing social dynamics? So this is something we are looking at. So it's already two research tracks on the way. Now we are going to take more questions. Yes. So, okay, yeah. Camille, you can. You have a microphone. So
yes. I want to. I'm not sure who this question is directed at, but partially to Peter, because he talked about transition. After Kenya was declared a middle-income country, I think it found itself there. I expected three things to happen to the humanitarian sector. One, a government that takes the leadership of coordination in full, so that there's no need for OCHA, there's no need for us. I don't know if that has happened. The second thing is I will wish to see transition from internationally led humanitarian response at the grassroots level to locally led response, such that national actors like us do major part of the work. It doesn't happen. It hasn't happened. We are hearing what Ahmed Idris told us, 0.4% going to local actors. And local actors, not only NGOs, it is the Red Cross, Red Crescent, it is the NDMS, National Government agencies, it is the civil society in general. And then the third thing I wanted to see is the transition of supplies from international hubs to market-led supply provision. In that, if I will do a flood response in Wajir, I'll buy the goods in Wajir so that the money remains there. How far have we transited in those three things? Thank you.
Okay, thank you. My name is Basil Mokulomba from World Vision. Question to the panel. I'm not so sure who will take it up. I was just trying to follow through the aspect of humanitarian transition in relation to the role of the private sector. I would beg to hear what your opinion is in terms of Kenya's move towards the involvement of private sector, and then what more would you recommend for humanitarian actors like us to do to have more involvement of the private sector? Thank you.
Yeah, and then Marie-Thérèse.
Okay, thank you. I'm Nick Wasuna from UNICEF. I really want to support Peter's presentation in terms of the system strengthening of service providers, of government, national and county-led. I've seen how that system works and how, if we as partners look to support that, we're going down a sustainability line. One of the issues I do hear in Kenya from county governments is there are parallel systems running within the government, within the county, that the county government is not in control of. So coordination is not centralized around the county. So certainly support that position. But the question I'd then ask is, in our transition, is where are our development partners? As humanitarians, we should now be speaking with our development partners. I've just seen pictures from the floods in northern Kenya. The roads are wiped out. The bridges are wiped out. The boreholes are no longer functioning. These were not put in by humanitarian partners. This is critical infrastructure that, of course, we'll use, but who is advising the risk-informed programming that we actually need in a country like Kenya as we're transitioning, and ultimately to have government lead the response? I look forward to the day where government will provide all the services it requires through all its different arms that are empowered or supported or provided technical assistance by those of us in the room here. Thank you.
Thank you. And I suggest we take the last question from Marie-Thérèse. I don't know who you are, but please go ahead.
Merci. Merci à tous les panélistes pour la richesse de vos exposés sur la question de la transition humanitaire. Ma question, en fait, s'adresse à M. Peter, qui a parlé dans son exposé de la transition humanitaire en ce qui concerne les questions qui touchent la nutrition des enfants. Et ma préoccupation ici est de savoir pour vous quelle est la différence que vous faites entre un programme d'urgence, un programme d'urgence et un programme de développement concernant la nutrition d'un enfant, pour le bien-être d'un enfant. Est-ce que pour vous, il y a une différence lorsqu'on se trouve dans le cas des programmes d'urgence, parce qu'il faut nourrir l'enfant qui est en souffrance, ou lorsqu'on mène des programmes de développement à long terme? Quelle différence faites-vous en ce cas-là pour le bien-être de l'enfant? Merci.
Merci pour la question. I think that there is no difference. It's impossible to tell. In Kenya, some of my colleagues here have worked a lot on a system which, in an emergency, is just more children. And then how does the international and local response partners decide to support the health facility or the health system to respond to more children. So they're exactly the same children, it's exactly the same response. It's just how much can the local system, what is its capacity to respond to that number of children, and what more support is needed wider than that capacity. There's no way to tell the difference between children, and you don't treat the children differently. And personally, I think that that's true for 95% of all activities that we do in emergency response. Shall I do quickly on the where are the development partners? So I worked for UNICEF for 15 years, so I feel I can be a little bit not rude but sharp. Apart from MSF in this room, any of the NGOs or UN agencies here would say that they're only emergency or humanitarian or only development? You are the development partners. You mentioned water and water points and so on. In UNICEF, you have the WASH department who put in those boreholes. So more to the point is how does the person who is using that water point, how do they experience UNICEF in this case, UNICEF's support to that water point, whether it's a drought or a quiet period?
Okay. I'll respond to the issue of the private sector engagement, and I think I'll also ask Idris to add on that. And also maybe you can respond to the issue of the market-led transitions. We're not engaged in that, but we coordinate actions towards that. So in the private sector, I mean, there's definitely a role that the private sector can play within the humanitarian response, and they have played a big role. Private sector engagement remains a critical pillar within the decisions that came out of the World Humanitarian Summit, issues to do with innovation, issues to do with just data analysis, and also just providing assistance to affected victims. There are several recommendations that came out of that on what the role of the private sector is in that. So there's definitely a role that can be played. In Kenya, they have been deeply involved in emergency response, and we saw alongside the corporate social responsibility. We've seen the private sector coming out, trying to fundraise for situations. They've come out to fundraise for drought. They've come out to provide, to partner with humanitarian agencies and provide goods, food items, water tracking, and all that. So there's definitely a role that can be played by private sector. We used to have the private sector network that was being managed by Equity, but I need to check what happened, because I think it's still going on. But after we close the OCHA office and hand it over to that establishment, then maybe we need to find out, and then maybe you can see how your organization can plug into that. On the issue of, there was a mention that once the local capacity is established, then we can do away with certain organizations. I think that will be the desire, not necessarily to do away, but because like OCHA, our mandate is not just to strengthen the capacity. It's a mandate that extends towards strengthening the capacity of the United Nations response. And to do this, we do this in partnership now with governments, local entities, and all that. So that has to be relooked into.
Sorry,
a word of conclusion? Yes.
Yeah, so Trufi gave me the task of responding to two questions. So Basil, I think my view of the private sector, there are two ways to look at it. One is you assess the private sector as sources of risks themselves and as accumulators of risk. And this is around the whole conversation of how are investments happening in developing countries. Is there a coordinated approach that focuses on risk screening, risk minimization to communities? And if we get that part right and work with the private sector to reduce the risks that they create themselves, that is one of the first main achievements we can have. But more importantly, remember, one of the strategies for risk management is risk transfer. And so you can transfer that to the private sector, and there are strategies around insurance that can be utilized better in developing countries to assist in reducing vulnerability. But more importantly, I think it's also use of tools and approaches that are being utilized in the private sector to be adapted in the humanitarian work. Innovation that exists in different companies, corporations, how can we take that up? Around the focus on a supply chain model to a market-led model, yeah, Idris, I think you hit the nail on the head. You will remember a couple of years there was this entire conversation about how the aid sector itself, especially the food aid sector, was only contributing to creating artificial markets for farmers from developed countries, the donor countries. So instead of donating the total value in cash or other monetary forms, you donate a value in form of actual material assistance. And that has an impact of perverting local markets, and the huge studies that have been done about that. But if we were to support certain initiatives right now, like the initiative to move transition humanitarian response from commodity-based to cash programming, that itself can help in spurring growth of a market model approach. So it's how you and I can push and support that. Thank you.
Before we wrap up the session, I wanted to give you the floor, Professor Dulo, for maybe a few concluding words. You've introduced the session by looking at a kind of historical perspective on the evolution of the humanitarian sector in Kenya. We've outlined some directions for future evolutions and transitions. How do you think that they relate to the historical development of that field in the country?
Thank you. I think there was one pertinent question that was asked that maybe I needed to repeat. That whatever we are doing, are our people better after so many years, or they are still stuck in the same situation? And are there any suggestions to improve this? And what Idris is saying is, to my opinion, is part of the problem. There are a lot of researches that have been done to shift our thinking about human beings. Despite the fact that we can be very vulnerable, but in many circumstances, people have turned those vulnerabilities into capabilities in many, many ways, in the most difficult of circumstances. That is, if we appreciate that people have agencies, even when they are confined in prisons, even when they are confined in their sick beds, people have agencies and they want to really contribute to their situations. And as humanitarian workers, when we take that into account, it does change the way we think and the way we act. I wanted, there was something that was raised again about figures about Nigeria, Kenya, the inequality that we find in humanitarian assistance. Of course, as we may know, this is a big thing. It's not only in Africa, but it drives a lot of the processes that we see. For example, in our own country, the vulnerability that we see, the figures that you saw I put on the table, many of them can have, it's not poverty per se. My argument has always been, it is not poverty per se, it is inequality. Because inequality has many ways of changing, of determining the way we think. So, for example, averages don't tell us the truth. We are told that Kenya is now a lower middle income country. Nigeria is the biggest economy in the continent, if I'm not wrong, Prof. It is the biggest economy, but Nigeria has overtaken India as the country with the highest number of the poorest people in the world in terms of ratio to the population. What does averages tell you? Averages don't tell you the whole truth. So I guess maybe this is where we come in when we disaggregate that kind of data. You know, economists would really help. What is the way forward? I guess we must just go back to that principle of humanity. All of us, whether in government, whether in the humanitarian sector, and whether, you know, in the academics, because I think, as they said, you know, a threat to a human being in Kenya is a threat to a human being everywhere in the rest of the world, isn't it? Yeah. So, of course, there are things that we are doing. As I said earlier, some of them we are doing in a hurry. We want to save lives. We could do them better, but we can only do that when we learn from each other. And then this type of conversation would definitely help. Our job is going to be made much more difficult because nature, as the late Wangari Maathai told us, nature is very unforgiving. And we are, you know, tinkering with nature in such a way that some of the conversation we are having here may be useless if we don't quickly do something. But then, of course, finally, we must address the imbalances, the dichotomies that Idris was talking about. Thank you.
Thank you very much. And on this note, I suggest that we close this roundtable. There will be plenty of room for other conversations, questions, and even possibly answers, I think, over lunchtime. I guess lunch is probably provided somewhere.
Yes, many thanks. So I think maybe the main lesson that we learned from the panel that we must absolutely learn to decategorize, because all those categories stick us in some way of doing that is always the same, and avoid us to really think about the real factors and solutions.